Tonight, we do not mourn, we remember. We walk the corridors of libraries that burned and libraries that drowned, libraries carved into mountains, and libraries buried beneath volcanic ash. We follow the thread of human knowledge through darkness, through silence, through the long night of forgetting. There is a kind of grief that has no name, the sorrow we feel for things we never knew we lost. A book that burned before our ancestors were born. A scroll that dissolved in seawater while empires rose and fell above the waves. A manuscript that crumbled to dust in a forgotten corner of a monastery while monks who might have copied it slept unknowing in their cells. Tonight's journey carries us through the libraries of the ancient world, not as tourist attractions or archaeological sites, but as living places where human beings gathered knowledge, preserved understanding, and trusted that what they saved would reach us across the centuries. Some of that trust was honored. We read Plato because someone copied his dialogues. We know Homer because scribes thought his verses worth preserving. We understand the movements of planets because Babylonian astronomers recorded their observations on clay tablets that survived the collapse of their civilization. But for every text that reached us, countless others did not. The Library of Alexandria, that legendary repository that haunts Western imagination, represents only the most famous of these losses. Across the ancient world, in temple archives and palace collections, in monastery scriptoria and merchant libraries, in hidden vaults and mountain caves, knowledge accumulated was threatened, was sometimes usurped, and sometimes lost. This is not a story of destruction alone. It is a story of preservation against impossible odds, of monks copying texts through centuries of darkness, of Islamic scholars translating Greek philosophy while Europe forgot how to read it, of carbonized scrolls in volcanic ash that modern technology is only now learning to decipher, of the extraordinary efforts humans have made to ensure that what one generation learns, the next can inherit. The night is long. Let us walk together through the libraries of ages past, through chambers lit by torchlight and halls open to Mediterranean sun, through archives buried and archives drowned, through the silence where once there was the scratching of stylus on clay and quill on parchment. Let us honor what was preserved and mourn what was lost. Let us remember that we are custodians of knowledge passed to us through chains of preservation stretching back millennia, and that we bear responsibility to pass it forward. The libraries wait in darkness. Their shelves still remember names. Let us listen for the whispers of books that speak across the silence of centuries. At the mouth of the Nile, where the great river spreads into fingers of water reaching toward the Mediterranean, Alexander the Great paused in his conquest of the world to imagine a city. The year was 331 BCE. Alexander was 25 years old, had already conquered Persia, and would be dead within 8 years. But in that moment, standing where fresh water met salt, where Egypt met the sea, where Africa touched the trade routes that connected East and West, He saw something that would outlast his empire, his legend, his name carved into the memory of civilizations. He saw Alexandria. The city rose rapidly after Alexander's death under the Ptolemaic dynasty that inherited Egypt from his fractured empire. Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's generals, understood that power rests not only on armies, but on legitimacy, on culture, on the soft authority that comes from being center of learning and civilization. He and his successors, particularly Ptolemy the Philadelphus, created institutions that would make Alexandria the intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world. The Museum, or museum, was established as a research institute where scholars could study, debate, and advance human understanding. And attached to the museum, or perhaps parallel to it, was the library, that legendary collection that would become the most famous in ancient history. The ambition was extraordinary. The Ptolemy sought to collect all the world's knowledge, every book ever written, in every language, from every land. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbor were searched for books, which were confiscated, copied, and, according to some accounts, the copies, rather than the originals, were returned to their owners. Agents were sent to Athens, Rhodes, and other centers of learning to purchase or copy texts. Ptolemy allegedly borrowed the official Athenian copies of plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, posted 15 talents of silver as security, an enormous sum, and then kept the originals, sending Athens copies instead, and forfeiting his deposit. The determination to acquire texts bordered on obsession. What did the library contain? We cannot know with certainty. Ancient accounts disagree wildly on the number of scrolls. Estimates range from 40,000 to 700,000, depending on the source and what was being counted. But we can imagine the scope. Greek literature, certainly, Homer and Hesiod, the tragedians and comedians, the philosophers from Thales to Aristotle, Egyptian texts on medicine, astronomy, religion, translated into Greek for scholars who did not read hieroglyphics, Persian and Babylonian works on astrology and mathematics, Jewish scriptures, the Septuagint, that Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was created in Alexandria according to tradition by 72 scholars working independently who produced identical translations, a miracle that testified to divine guidance. The library was more than storage. It was an active center of scholarship where the greatest minds of the ancient world gathered to read, to research, to debate, to advance human understanding. Euclid compiled his elements there, the geometry textbook that would be used for over 2,000 years, that would shape how humans think about mathematical proof and logical reasoning. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth there, achieving remarkable accuracy through geometry and careful observation of sun angles at different latitudes. Aristarchus proposed that the earth orbits the sun there, an idea so far ahead of its time that it would be forgotten and would have to be rediscovered by Copernicus 18 centuries later. The scholars at Alexandria developed textual criticism, the systematic analysis of texts to determine their authenticity, to correct errors introduced by copying, to establish authoritative versions. They created the first systematic classification systems for organizing knowledge. They compiled encyclopedias and dictionaries and commentaries. They created the intellectual tools that later civilizations would use to manage their own knowledge. But the library was also entangled with power. The Ptolemies supported it because it brought prestige, because it attracted scholars whose presence enhanced Alexandria's reputation, because control of knowledge was a form of control. The library's collection methods, the confiscation of books from ships, the deception practiced on Athens, reveal that acquisition was not always ethical, that the ambition to collect everything sometimes overrode respect for ownership. The library served royal power even as it served human understanding. And then came the catastrophes, or did they? The burning of the library is one of history's most famous events. Yet scholars debate whether it happened as tradition claims. The most common account blames Julius Caesar, whose forces accidentally set fire to the harbor during the Alexandrian War in 48 BCE, with flames spreading to warehouses that may have contained books destined for the library. But contemporary accounts suggest the fire destroyed warehouses rather than the library itself, and the library continued functioning for centuries afterward. Other accounts blame later destructions. Christian mobs who destroyed the Serapeum in 391 CE, a temple that may have housed part of the library's collection. The Arab conquest in 641 CE, with the probably apocryphal story of Caliph Omar ordering books burned because they either contradicted the Quran and were therefore heretical, or agreed with it and were therefore redundant. But most scholars now believe the library's destruction was gradual rather than sudden, a slow decline through reduced funding, political instability, the departure of scholars, the failure to maintain and copy texts that deteriorated with age. The truth is that we do not know how the library died. We know only that it did, that an institution that once held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, that represented the accumulated knowledge of ancient civilizations, that employed the greatest scholars of its age, eventually ceased to exist. The buildings crumbled or were repurposed. The scrolls rotted or burned or were scattered. The catalog that once organized the collection was lost. So we cannot even know for certain what was lost. What survives is memory. The Library of Alexandria became legend, became symbol, became the ghost that haunts every library that came after. When we mourn lost knowledge, we mourn Alexandria. When we commit to preserving what remains, we honor what Alexandria tried to do. The library at the delta's edge, where rivers met the sea, it lives on not in its scrolls, which are gone, but in its ambition, which we have inherited. The night deepens over the modern city that still bears Alexander's name. Somewhere beneath streets and buildings, beneath layers of construction and reconstruction, The foundations of the ancient library may still exist. Stones that once held shelves, that once held scrolls, that once held thoughts that now are silence. The shelves remember, even in ruin, even in absence, even in the darkness that has fallen where once there was light, the shelves remember. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps memory is its own form of preservation. Perhaps the library that was buried twice still lives in every collection that aspires to comprehensiveness, in every scholar who seeks to understand, in every reader who opens a book and feels connected to minds that lived millennia ago. The library at the Delta's edge, the library that was and is no more, the library that persists in the longing it left behind. Beneath the Egyptian desert, sealed for millennia, chambers wait. They wait in the Valley of the Kings, where pharaohs were buried with texts to guide them through the underworld. They wait beneath temple complexes, where priests stored records of rituals and offerings. They wait in the dry sand that preserves what moisture would destroy, holding papyrus and leather and wood in conditions that approach immortality. The ancient Egyptians understood something profound about knowledge, that it served purposes beyond the living. The books of the dead, those collections of spells and prayers and instructions, were not libraries for scholars to study, but libraries for the dead to use. Each book was personalized, created for a specific individual, designed to help that person navigate the dangers of the afterlife and achieve eternal life in the field of reeds. The scribes who created these texts knew their work would be buried with its owner, sealed in darkness, never to be read by living eyes again. Yet they wrote with care, with precision, with beauty that suggests they believed the dead truly would read, truly would need these words. Consider what this means. The scribe sits at his workspace, papyrus before him, pigments prepared, black ink for text, red ink for headings and rubrics, colors for illustrations. He is creating a book for someone who is dying or already dead. He inscribes spells that will allow the deceased to transform into a falcon, to pass through gates guarded by demons, to speak the words that will justify a life when the heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. He paints scenes of the judgment, the jackal-headed Anubis adjusting the scales, the ibis-headed Thoth recording the result, the deceased standing anxious beside their own heart. The scribe knows this book will be rolled, placed in a wooden case, positioned beside the mummy in its coffin, sealed in a tomb that no living person is meant to enter again. He is creating a library of one reader, and that reader is dead. The theology that produced these texts is complex, sophisticated, developed over 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization. The Egyptians believed that human beings possess multiple souls: the Keka, the life force; the Ba, the personality; the Ak, the transfigured spirit that could move between worlds. Death separated these elements, and the elaborate mortuary practices were designed to maintain their connection, to provide a body for the K to inhabit, to ensure that the Bey could leave the tomb during the day and return at night. The books of the dead provided instructions for this process, spells that would protect the deceased from dangers, prayers that would appeal to gods, maps of the underworld's geography. But the books of the dead were only part of Egypt's libraries for the dead. The pyramid texts, inscribed on the walls of Old Kingdom pyramids, were the oldest religious literature in the world. Spells meant to help the pharaoh ascend to the sky, to join the circumpolar stars that never set, to become one with Osiris in the underworld. The coffin texts, painted on Middle Kingdom coffins, democratized these royal spells, making afterlife accessible to anyone who could afford a properly inscribed coffin. The texts evolved, accumulated, formed a tradition that stretched across millennia and influenced religions that would emerge long after Egypt's decline. The temples maintained their own libraries. The House of Life, found in major temple complexes, was both library and scriptorium, where sacred texts were stored and copied, where priests studied the rituals they would perform. These were restricted archives. Not all knowledge was meant for all eyes. The temples housed texts on medicine, astronomy, magic, theology, texts that represented the accumulated wisdom of one of humanity's oldest civilizations. Some of this knowledge was practical. Medical papyri describe treatments that modern analysis shows were sometimes effective, and some was religious, concerned with maintaining the cosmic order that the Egyptians called Ma'at. The temple libraries served living priests and their communities, but they also served the divine. The Egyptians believed that texts, once written, had power, that the words themselves could affect reality, that speaking a name could bring what it named into being, that written spells continued working even when no one read them. The libraries were not merely storage, but active repositories of power, places where sacred language maintained its efficacy simply by existing. When archaeologists entered these sealed chambers in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found what the dry Egyptian climate had preserved: papyrus that would have rotted in humid environments survived intact, medical texts, mathematical treatises, literary works, administrative records, personal letters. The full range of Egyptian literate culture emerged from tombs and temple ruins. We learned to read hieroglyphics again, thanks to the Rosetta Stone and Champollion's genius. We could hear voices that had been silent for millennia. The Edwin Smith papyrus, discovered in a tomb at Luxor, revealed Egyptian surgical knowledge. Systematic case studies describing injuries and treatments with rational analysis that prefigures modern medical approach. The Ebers Papyrus cataloged hundreds of remedies, mixing effective treatments with magical spells, as reflecting a worldview that did not separate medicine from religion. The Rhind Mathematical Papyrus demonstrated Egyptian mathematical sophistication, knowledge of fractions, geometric calculations, practical problems that architects and engineers would have faced. Each papyrus that survived was accident, was luck, was the confluence of dry climate and sealed chambers and the care that ancient Egyptians took in preparing their dead. But for every papyrus that survived, how many did not? The climate preserved what was buried, but not what remained exposed. The great temple libraries were eventually destroyed by conquering armies, by religious zealots who saw Egyptian religion as demonic, by the simple passage of time. The Library of Alexandria may have been the most famous, but countless smaller collections were lost as Egyptian civilization declined, as temples were closed, as knowledge that had accumulated over millennia was scattered or destroyed. The chamber beneath the sand holds what we have, holds it in darkness, in silence, in the preservation that comes from being forgotten. The scribes who wrote these texts are dust themselves now, their names mostly forgotten, despite their prayers that they be remembered. But their work survives, their careful characters, their illustrated spells, their maps of the underworld, all preserved because they were buried, because they were meant for the dead rather than the living, because the dead keep their possessions in ways the living cannot. Listen, in the silence of the sealed chamber, can you hear them? The scratching of a reed pen on papyrus, the murmur of a scribe speaking the words he writes, testing their sound, ensuring their correctness, the prayers of priests who believed their texts maintained cosmic order, the hopes of ordinary Egyptians who wanted only to live forever in the field of reeds where crops grew tall without labor, and the dead lived as they had in life, only better. The chamber holds them all, holds their voices in the ink they left, holds their faith in the texts they prepared, holds their humanity in the concerns that drove them to write. 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization preserved in fragments, revealed in discoveries still emerging from the sand. The night is long, the chamber is dark, but the scrolls within it still whisper, still tell stories, still await readers who will come with careful and patient eyes and willingness to listen to what the dead wished to say. In the land between rivers, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved fertile crescents through desert, the world's first libraries were born, not the grand collections of Alexandria, those would come millennia later, but the humble accumulations of clay tablets in temple archives, where priests recorded offerings and scribes learned their craft, where the technology of writing was invented, and where humanity first discovered that memory could be made external, could be stored outside the fragile vessel of human brain. The cities rise from the marshlands like dreams: Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Lagash, Babylon, Nineveh, names that sound like incantations that echo across 5,000 years, that mark places where humans first gathered in numbers large enough to require administration, to require record keeping, to require writing. The tablets began as accounts. So many sheep, so much grain, this much owed, that much paid. Pictographs evolved into cuneiform, those wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. The medium was humble. Clay is everywhere in Mesopotamia, but what it enabled was revolutionary. For the first time, human thought could outlive the human thinker. The temple archives at Nippur, sacred to Enlil, king of the gods, accumulated tablets across centuries. Scribes learned their craft there, copying texts over and over as practice, so that we have multiple copies of some works and none of others. The accidents of education determining what survived. The priests maintained records of rituals and offerings, calendars and astronomical observations, contracts and correspondence. The temple was not only religious center, but administrative hub, and the archive served practical purposes, even as it preserved sacred traditions. But Mesopotamian literacy extended beyond temples. Schools trained scribes for service to palace and marketplace. Merchants kept records of transactions. Kings commissioned monuments inscribed with their achievements, boasts, and propaganda, but also historical records that tell us who conquered whom, who built what temples, who brought what innovations. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a black stone stela, established laws that governed Babylonian society, property rights, family relations, professional responsibilities, punishments for crimes. The laws themselves are fascinating, revealing a society concerned with justice, even as it encoded inequality, establishing different punishments for harming free citizens versus slaves. And then there was literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh emerged from this clay, this accumulation of scribal tradition, this civilization that understood that stories matter. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, two-thirds god and one-third human, seeks immortality after his friend Enkidu dies. He travels to the edge of the world, finds Utnapishtim, who survived the Great Flood, learns that death cannot be escaped, returns to Uruk to see his city walls and understand that human achievement is the only immortality humans can attain. The story is profound, is moving, is recognizable across millennia. The grief for lost friends, the fear of death, the search for meaning, the eventual acceptance of human limits. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh represents the culmination of Mesopotamian bibliophilia. Ashurbanipal ruled the Assyrian Empire in the 7th century BC at its greatest extent, and he was unusual among warrior kings in his devotion to learning. He claimed to be able to read cuneiform, to understand Sumerian, by then a dead language, like Latin in medieval Europe, to appreciate the scribal arts. He sent agents across his empire to copy texts for his library, creating a collection that may have contained over 30,000 tablets, administrative records, literary texts, astronomical observations, medical treatises, magical incantations, divination manuals. The collection reveals what Mesopotamians thought worth preserving: mathematics for practical purposes, calculating areas, predicting astronomical events, managing construction projects, medicine that mixed rational observation with magical healing, some treatments effective, others superstitious, all reflecting sincere attempt to understand and cure illness, omens and divination, reading the will of gods in the entrails of sacrificed animals, in the movements of planets, in the patterns of oil on water. The boundary between science and religion was not yet drawn. Observation of nature and communication with divine were parts of the same seeking. But Nineveh fell. The Medes and Babylonians, tired of Assyrian dominance, allied to destroy the empire. In 612 BCE, they sacked the city that had terrorized the ancient Near East. The palace was burned, the walls were broken, the population was killed or scattered. And the library? The library was buried in the destruction. But this burial was preservation. Fire bakes clay. The flames that consumed the palace hardened the tablets, made them more durable than they had been when merely dried. The rubble that collapsed atop them protected them from weather and from later disturbance. What was meant as destruction became inadvertent archive. The tablets lay buried for over 2 millennia. Austin Henry Laird began excavating Nineveh in the 1840s, uncovering colossal statues and carved reliefs that would fill British museum halls. The tablets came later, were at first poorly understood, were gradually deciphered as scholars worked out the complexities of cuneiform script and the multiple languages it encoded. George Smith, working in the British Museum in the 1870s, was translating tablets when he realized he was reading a flood story that paralleled Genesis. Utnapishtim, warned by the gods, building a boat, taking animals aboard, releasing birds to find land. The discovery caused sensation, raised questions about biblical texts that are still debated, demonstrated that Mesopotamian literature contained treasures waiting to be rediscovered. The marshlands of southern Iraq, where Tigris and Euphrates merge before reaching the Persian Gulf, were home to the earliest cities. The marshes were drained by Saddam Hussein in the 1990s in retaliation against marsh Arab populations who had rebelled. After his fall, the marshes were partially restored, but the cities of ancient Sumer lie beneath water tables altered by upstream dams, are eroding as water levels fluctuate, are threatened by climate change and political instability. The tablets already excavated are scattered across museums worldwide. The tablets still buried may be lost before archaeologists can reach them. The city of readers drowned not in literal flood, but in the accumulated catastrophes that ended Mesopotamian civilization. Conquest after conquest, the shift of power to Persia and Greece and Rome, the gradual abandonment of cuneiform as Aramaic and then Arabic came dominant scripts. The last cuneiform tablet dates to approximately 75 CE, an astronomical text, the final gasps of a scribal tradition 3,000 years old. After that, silence. The cities that invented writing forgot how to read it, but the tablets remain in museums and in unexcavated mounds, in private collections and in digital databases. The clay that held Gilgamesh's grief and Hammurabi's laws and Ashurbanipal's astronomical observations still exists. The words are still there, pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, waiting for readers who have learned to understand them. The moonlight falls on marshes now restored, on reeds bending in wind, on water that covers what once were cities. Beneath the water, beneath the silt, beneath the accumulated layers of millennia, the tablets wait. Some will be found, some will be lost, but the words they hold have already been read, have already spoken across the silence of ages, have already proven that memory can survive the civilizations that create it. The city of readers is drowned, but the reading continues. High above the desert floor, where cliff faces rise like walls against the sky, humans have carved libraries into living rock. The impulse makes sense. Stone endures. Stone resists fire and flood. Stone offers protection against the elements that destroy papyrus and parchment. But the caves and grottos that hold these archives were chosen for more than practical reasons. They were sacred spaces, liminal places where earth met sky, where monks and priests and pilgrims could retreat from the world to preserve what the world might destroy. The Mogao caves near Dunhuang, at the eastern edge of the Taklamakan Desert, began as a single cave carved by a Buddhist monk in 366 CE. According to legend, the monk Yuezun had a vision of 1,000 Buddhas bathed in golden light, and he excavated the first cave shrine as response to that vision. Over the next 1,000 years, other monks followed his example, carving nearly 500 caves into the cliff face, filling them with paintings and sculptures that depicted Buddhist cosmology, that told stories of the Buddha's lives, that created spaces for meditation and worship. But the caves also became libraries. Manuscripts accumulated, Buddhist sutras and commentaries, Taoist texts, Confucian classics, administrative documents, personal letters, works in Chinese and Tibetan and Sanskrit, and languages that scholars struggle to identify. At some point in the early 11th century, a small cave was sealed, its entrance plastered over and painted to match the surrounding walls. Inside were approximately 50,000 manuscripts and printed documents, along with paintings on silk and hemp, preserved by the dry desert climate. The sealed cave remained hidden for nearly 900 years. In 1900, a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu, who had taken upon himself to restore the neglected caves, discovered the hidden chamber while clearing sand from a corridor. What he found amazed him. A room packed with manuscripts, some carefully bundled, others scattered, all remarkably preserved. Wang did not understand the significance of what he had found, could not read most of the manuscripts, but he sensed their importance and appointed himself their guardian. Word spread slowly. Aurel Stein, a Hungarian British archaeologist, reached Dunhuang in 1907 and convinced Wang to sell him thousands of manuscripts for a small sum. Paul Pelliot, a French sinologist, arrived the following year and acquired more. Japanese, Russian, and Chinese expeditions followed. The manuscripts were scattered across museums in London, Paris, Berlin, St. Petersburg, Beijing, Tokyo. The dispersal that often follows discovery, that preserves by distributing even as it destroys the integrity of the original collection. What the manuscripts contained was extraordinary. The Diamond Sutra, printed in 868 CE, is the world's oldest dated printed book, a complete scroll, including a sopo colophon stating the date and the patron who funded its creation, demonstrating that printing technology existed in China centuries before Gutenberg. Buddhist texts in multiple languages showed how the religion adapted as it traveled the Silk Road. Medical texts, astronomical tables, mathematical treatises, literary works, the full range of medieval Chinese learning was represented, and personal documents, contracts, petitions, correspondence revealed the daily lives of ordinary people who lived along the Silk Road a millennium ago. The cave was a time capsule, sealed when the region faced threats, perhaps Tangut invasions, perhaps simply the decision that the manuscripts were safer hidden than exposed. Whoever sealed the cave intended for it to be reopened when danger passed. But the danger did not pass, or those who sealed it died without passing on the secret, or the monastery declined until no one remembered what was hidden. The cave waited through Mongol conquest and Ming dynasty and Qing dynasty, waited through the slow decline of the Silk Road as maritime trade placed overland routes, waited until a Taoist monk clearing sand noticed a crack in the plaster. Other mountain archives tell similar stories. The monastery of St. Catherine at the foot of Mount Sinai has held manuscripts since the 6th century, preserved by isolation and by the dry desert climate, protected by the Ottoman sultans who respected its Christian sanctity. The Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest complete New Testament manuscripts, was discovered there in the 19th century. The mountainous terrain of Ethiopia protected its Orthodox Christian libraries from Islamic conquest, preserving texts and traditions that linked African Christianity to its ancient roots. In Afghanistan, the caves of Bamiyan held Buddhist treasures before Taliban destruction. In the cliffs of the Judean desert, the caves of Qumran held the Dead Sea Scrolls for 2,000 years. In the mountains of Yemen, Jewish communities preserved manuscripts unknown elsewhere. The pattern repeats. Isolation preserves, caves protect, mountains keep secrets that plains and cities cannot. But the mountain archives also show the limits of preservation. The Mogao manuscripts were scattered, their integrity lost, their study complicated by dispersal across hostile nations. The Bamyan Buddhas were destroyed despite their remoteness. The Dead Sea Scrolls survived, but are fragmentary, and the full story of the community that produced them remains disputed. Isolation protects, but also hides. Manuscripts unread are not quite preserved. Knowledge unavailable is not quite saved. Tonight, the cliff face at Dunhuang, stands silent under stars that have watched these caves for 17 centuries. Inside, faded paintings still glow with colors that medieval monks mixed and applied, that depicted Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and the pure land that awaited the faithful. The manuscripts are gone, some to museums, some still buried in caves that have not been excavated, some destroyed by time and neglect despite the desert's dryness. But the caves themselves remain, carved into living stone, testimony to the faith that sought to preserve what the world destroys. The mountain holds what was entrusted to it, holds the memory of monks who climbed these heights to meditate and to copy texts, holds the prayers that were offered before painted walls, holds the silence that falls when the last pilgrim descends and night returns to the desert. The archive in the mountain, the library carved into stone, still standing, still holding, still waiting for those who will climb to hear what it has to say. In medieval Baghdad, where the Tigris caught starlight and reflected the domes of mosques, a different kind of library flourished, not carved in stone or buried in tombs, but alive with scholars who sought wisdom from every source, who translated every text they could acquire, who believed that knowledge was a form of worship and that understanding the world was a way of understanding God. The House of Wisdom, Bait al-Hikmah, emerged in the 9th century CE under the Abbasid caliphs, particularly al-Mamun, who ruled from 813 to 833. The caliph's passion for learning was legendary. He sent emissaries to Byzantine libraries seeking Greek manuscripts, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy. He established translation bureaus where scholars fluent in Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Arabic worked to render ancient texts into the language of the new Islamic civilization. He created an institution where scholars of different faiths and backgrounds could work together in pursuit of knowledge. The translation movement that centered on the House of Wisdom was one of history's great intellectual achievements. Greek works that might have been lost, or that were lost in the original and survive only in Arabic translation, were preserved, studied, commented upon, and transmitted to later generations. Aristotle was translated and became foundational for Islamic philosophy. Ptolemy's astronomy was translated and became the basis for astronomical work that would eventually influence Copernicus. Galen's medicine was translated and shaped medical practice across the Islamic world and beyond. Euclid's geometry was translated and taught, his methods becoming standard for mathematical proof. But the scholars of the House of Wisdom did not merely translate, they advanced. Al-Khwarizmi, working in 9th century Baghdad, systematized algebra, giving the discipline its name from the title of his book. Al-Jabr means restoration or completion. His work on Hindu Arabic numerals, including the crucial zero, would eventually transform European mathematics when translations reached the West. The word algorithm derives from the Latin rendering of his name. Al-Kindi applied Greek philosophical methods to Islamic questions, becoming the first Arab philosopher. Al-Razi compiled medical knowledge and added his own observations, creating encyclopedic works that would be translated into Latin and used in European universities for centuries. The library that supported this work was extensive, but it was not the only center of learning in the Islamic world. Cordoba in Spain boasted a library that reportedly held 400,000 volumes, larger than anything in Christian Europe at the time. Cairo's Dar al-Hikmah, House of Knowledge, established by the Fatimid caliphs, rivaled Baghdad's institutions. Libraries flourished in cities across the Islamic world, from Samarkand to Fez, from Isfahan to Palermo. The network of Islamic libraries preserved and transmitted knowledge that would have been lost if dependent on Christian Europe alone, where literacy had declined and libraries were small and specialized. The relationship between Islamic and European scholarship is complex, often misunderstood, frequently controversial. For centuries, Western narratives either ignored Islamic contributions or minimized them. More recent scholarship recognizes that European intellectual revival depended significantly on translations from Arabic, that Aristotle reached medieval Paris not directly from Athens but through Baghdad, that medical schools at Salerno and Montpellier learned from Arabic texts, that the Renaissance was built on foundations preserved by Islamic scholars. The transmission was not unidirectional. Islamic civilization also learned from its conquests, adopted technologies and ideas from Persia and India and China, but the preservation and development of Greek learning during centuries when Christian Europe forgot how to read it was Islamic civilization's distinctive contribution to human knowledge. The House of Wisdom's destruction came with the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258. The siege was brutal, the massacre immense. Some accounts claim 1 million killed, though the number is surely exaggerated. The rivers, it was said, ran red with blood and then black with ink as the Mongols threw books into the Tigris, destroying a library that had accumulated over 4 centuries. The destruction was not merely military, but civilizational. The Abbasid Caliphate, symbol of Islamic unity and learning, was ended, and the institutions it had supported were scattered or destroyed. But the Mongol destruction, catastrophic as it was, did not end Islamic learning. Libraries in other cities survived. Scholars who fled Baghdad carried knowledge with them. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt preserved and continued intellectual traditions. The Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires that would emerge in later centuries created their own libraries and academies. Islamic scholarship continued, adapted, evolved, even as the House of Wisdom's specific glory was mourned. What was lost in Baghdad, we cannot know with certainty. The burning of a library destroys not only what existed, but the record of what existed. Some manuscripts survived in other collections, others existed only in Baghdad and vanished. works known only through later references, texts that might have transformed our understanding, scientific observations that might have advanced knowledge, all consumed in the sack of a city, all lost when soldiers who did not read chose destruction over preservation. The garden of folded pages, for manuscripts were often folded or rolled, stored in containers that protected them from light and air, bloomed for 4 centuries in Baghdad. Scholars cultivated knowledge there, grafted Greek philosophy onto Islamic theology, grew new understanding in the fertile soil of institutional support and intellectual freedom. The garden was burned, but seeds had scattered. In libraries across the Islamic world, in translations that reached Europe, in the continued work of scholars who survived or never lived in Baghdad, the knowledge cultivated in that garden continued to grow. Tonight, Baghdad is a city of different concerns, modern conflicts, contemporary struggles, the weight of recent history that obscures the medieval glory. But somewhere beneath the modern city, beneath the layers of destruction and reconstruction, the ground holds memory of what was. The house of wisdom stood here. Scholars gathered here. Knowledge bloomed here in darkness, in the quiet rooms where translators worked by lamplight, where commentators added their insights to ancient texts, where human understanding advanced through patient labor. The garden is gone, but gardens can be replanted. Knowledge, once created, can be recovered if fragments survive. The house of wisdom's true legacy is not the building that burned, but the tradition of seeking wisdom wherever it can be found, of translating across languages and cultures, of believing that understanding is a form of worship. That tradition survived Baghdad's fall. That tradition continues wherever scholars seek truth without regard to its origin. The folded pages are scattered now, held in libraries from Istanbul to London to Tehran. But the garden they came from still blooms in memory, still offers its fruit to those who seek it, still testifies that knowledge can flourish even in darkness, that wisdom can survive destruction, that what humans learn can outlast the civilizations that learned it. In the heart of ancient cities, beneath temples where priests performed rites that common eyes must not witness, vaults were carved to hold what the world must not see. These were not libraries for public access, not collections for scholars to browse, but archives of restricted knowledge, texts too sacred for the uninitiated, too dangerous for the unprepared, too powerful for those who had not earned the right to read them. The temple at Karnak, that vast complex where Egyptian priests served Amun-Ra for nearly 2,000 years, contained archive rooms where sacred texts were stored. The priests who served there underwent years of training, learned the proper rituals, were gradually introduced to secrets that lower ranks could not access. The innermost sanctum, where the statue of the god resided, was entered only by the highest priest on the most sacred occasions. The texts that supported these rituals, the exact words to be spoken, the precise gestures to be made, the meanings behind the ceremonies, were kept in restricted archives, copied by authorized scribes, never shared outside the priesthood. What gave these texts their power? Was it genuine danger, genuine knowledge that could harm if misused? Or did the restriction itself create value, make common knowledge seem precious by limiting access? The answer is probably both. Some restricted texts contained practical knowledge, medical treatments that could poison as well as cure, astronomical observations that gave predictive power, administrative records that revealed how the temple accumulated its wealth. Other restricted texts were more purely religious, rituals and spells whose efficacy depended on proper performance by properly authorized priests. The power was partly real and partly constructed, but the effect was the same. Restricted archives created and reinforced hierarchies of knowledge. The mystery schools of ancient Greece operated on similar principles. The Eleusinian mysteries, held near Athens for nearly 2,000 years, initiated participants into secrets that none could reveal on pain of death. We know remarkably little about what actually happened during the initiation because the penalty was effective. Participants kept the secret. We know there was a sacred drink, a dark room, a revelation of some kind, an experience that participants described as transformative. But the specific content remains unknown, remains restricted even now, when the temples are ruins and the priests are dust. The Pythagorean communities, those mathematical mystics who believed numbers were the key to understanding the universe, maintained strict secrecy about their doctrines. The discovery of irrational numbers, that the square root of 2 cannot be expressed as a ratio of whole numbers, was allegedly kept secret, perhaps because it threatened the elegant simplicity of their numerical philosophy. The legend holds that Hippasus, who revealed the secret, was drowned for his betrayal. Whether or not the story is true, it captures the ethos of restricted knowledge, that some truths are dangerous, that some knowledge must be protected from those who might misuse it. The Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah maintained that certain texts should be studied only by mature scholars who had mastered other branches of learning first. The Zohar, that central text of Kabbalistic thought, was traditionally restricted, not forbidden, but surrounded with requirements that limited access. One should be over 40, should be married, should have studied Torah and Talmud extensively before approaching the mysteries of divine emanation and the nature of evil. The restrictions created a hierarchy of knowledge, ensured that those who encountered the most profound ideas had preparation to understand them, protected students from confusion that might lead to heresy or despair. But what happened to restricted archives when their institutions failed? Some secrets were lost when the last initiates died without passing them on. The Eleusinian mysteries ended when Christian emperors closed the temples. Whatever was revealed in those dark chambers was lost when the priests who knew it were scattered. Other secrets were eventually revealed as restricted texts were copied and distributed, as once forbidden knowledge became common property. The Kabbalistic texts that were once restricted are now available to anyone who wishes to read them, though the tradition still maintains that proper preparation is necessary for proper understanding. The Vatican's archives, now officially called the Apostolic Archives, contain documents accumulated over more than 12 centuries, papal correspondence, diplomatic records, trial transcripts, accounting records, the machinery of church administration preserved in 53 miles of shelving. For centuries, access was strictly limited. Even now, documents from certain periods remain closed to researchers. What secrets do they hold? Probably nothing dramatic. The church has opened more archives over time, and the revelations have generally been historical details rather than shocking discoveries. But the mystique remains. The very fact of restriction suggests importance, creates the possibility of secrets, even if none exist. The restricted archive raises questions that transcend historical curiosity. What knowledge should be limited? What secrets are worth keeping? The modern debate over classified information, over proprietary research, over intellectual property echoes ancient practices of restriction. The technology has changed. Encryption replaces sealed vaults, but the principle remains. Some knowledge is dangerous, some secrets must be protected, some restrictions serve legitimate purposes, but restriction also enables abuse. The priest who controls access to sacred texts controls his community's relationship with the divine. The institution that restricts information prevents oversight of its actions. The power that comes from knowing what others do not can be used to help or to exploit. The vault beneath the temple held both sacred wisdom and the machinery of control, both genuine mysteries and political manipulation. Tonight, we do not enter the vault. The doors remain sealed, or the vault itself has crumbled, or the keys were lost when the temple fell. What was stored there? We can only imagine. Sacred texts and administrative records, genuine secrets and ordinary paperwork, the profound and the mundane, mixed together as they always are in human institutions. The vault held what the priests thought worth hiding, and what is worth hiding tells us something about those who hid it, about what they valued, about what they feared, about how they understood the relationship between knowledge and power. The vault beneath the temple, the sealed archive that protected knowledge from those who must not know, still sealed, or finally opened, or simply vanished when the temple fell and no one remembered what lay below. The secrets it held are still secrets or have been revealed, or were never quite as important as the restrictions suggested. The vault remains, even if only as idea. The notion that some knowledge is too dangerous for common access, that some truths must be protected, that the way to wisdom lies through gates that only the worthy may pass. Across ancient seas, vessels carried more than grain and wine. They carried libraries. The book trade of the classical world was maritime, dependent on ships that crossed Mediterranean and sailed the monsoon routes of the Indian Ocean. When those ships sank, as ships inevitably do, their cargoes went with them, including whatever manuscripts they carried. The seafloor is a library that no reader can access, holding texts that dissolved in salt water, that became food for creatures that know nothing of human learning. The book trade of the ancient world was substantial. Alexandria's ambition to collect all knowledge required acquisition from distant lands, and acquisition required transport. Merchants carried texts alongside other goods, knowing that libraries in major cities would pay well for rare manuscripts. Copies of popular works, Homer, the tragedians, philosophical treatises, circulated throughout the Greek speaking world, traveling by ship from production centers like Alexandria and Pergamon to consumers in Rome and Antioch and Ephesus. The mechanics of ancient book production made maritime trade essential. Papyrus, the primary writing material of the classical world, came from Egypt, where the papyrus plant grew in the Nile Delta. Processed papyrus was exported throughout the Mediterranean, and with it, the blank scrolls that scribes would fill with text. A library in Rome or Athens depended on Egyptian papyrus, transported by ship, processed and inscribed, then transported again as finished book. Every scroll represented multiple sea voyages, multiple opportunities for the sea to claim what humans had created. The Antikythera wreck provides glimpse of what was lost. Discovered off the coast of a small Greek island in 1900, the wreck contained treasures that drew immediate attention: bronze statues, silver coins, pottery. But among the cargo were also traces of what might have been books. The famous Antikythera mechanism, that ancient computer that modeled celestial movements, was found there. Testimony to sophistication that scholars had not expected from ancient technology. And there were suggestions of organic material that might have been papyrus, though the sea had destroyed any texts that once existed. How many ships like this sank? The ancient Mediterranean was busy with trade, and shipwrecks were common. Storms, pirates, navigation errors, structural failures. The hazards were many, and the losses were accepted as cost of doing business. When a ship carrying grain went down, hunger might result. When a ship carrying unique manuscripts went down, knowledge was lost. The merchants who owned the cargo were affected. The scholars who might have read those texts never knew what they had missed. The maritime routes that connected civilizations also connected libraries. The Silk Road's maritime alternative, the sea routes that linked China, Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and East Africa, carried texts as well as goods. Buddhist manuscripts traveled from India to China by sea, complementing the overland routes that crossed Central Asia. Islamic texts circulated throughout the Indian Ocean world, carried by merchants who brought not only goods, but also faith and learning. When monsoons sank these ships, these texts went with them. The sea preserves selectively. Shipwrecks in cold, deep water preserve what warmer, shallower water destroys. The Baltic Sea has yielded remarkably intact wrecks, their organic materials preserved by cold and low oxygen. The Mediterranean, warmer and more active, destroys what it claims. Papyrus dissolves, parchment rots, paper disintegrates. The books that traveled ancient sea routes are gone. destroyed and as thoroughly as if they had been burned. Underwater archaeology has recovered much from ancient wrecks, amphorae and anchors, statues and coins, ship structures, and navigation equipment. But texts are almost never found. The materials are too fragile, the conditions too hostile. The ship's library, if it had one, is always the first cargo lost to the sea. Consider what this means for our understanding of the ancient world. The texts we have are those that survived on land, that were copied and recopied, that found their way to libraries that endured. The texts lost at sea, unique copies that were being transported for sale, manuscripts that existed only on that ship, knowledge traveling from one library to another that never arrived. These are lost not merely to destruction, but to the absolute erasure that ocean provides. We do not even know what we lost, cannot identify the titles that sank, cannot mourn specific absences because we do not know they ever existed. The ships of scrolls sailed toward forgotten shores, shores that the ships never reached, carrying cargoes that no one now remembers. The sailors who drowned thought of their lives, not of the manuscripts they carried. The merchants who lost cargoes calculated their financial losses, not the cultural ones. Only later, when scholars sought texts that could not be found, did anyone wonder what the sea had claimed. Tonight, the Mediterranean is calm beneath stars that have watched these waters since before humans sailed them. The sea keeps its secrets, refuses to surrender what it has taken, offers no catalog of its holdings. Somewhere beneath the waves, the timbers of 1,000 trading ships have rotted, their cargoes scattered, their manuscripts long dissolved. The knowledge they carried became salt water and sediment, became part of the sea itself, became nothing that can be recovered. The ships of scrolls, sailing always toward shores they never reached, carrying knowledge that dissolved in darkness, that became one with the depths, that passed from human memory completely. The sea remembers nothing, or remembers everything, or memory has no meaning in the depths where sunlight does not reach. The sails are set. The voyage begins. The destination always is uncertain. On rocky islands, where Atlantic storms crash against cliffs, where isolation provides protection that walls cannot, monks huddled in stone cells, copying texts through centuries when the rest of Europe forgot how to read. The monasteries of Ireland and Scotland, Iona, Lindisfarne, Skellig Michael, became arks of learning, preserving what the collapsing Roman world had endangered. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a single event, but a prolonged decline. Cities shrank as trade networks collapsed, roads deteriorated without the centralized authority that maintained them. Literacy, which had been common among Roman elites, became rare as schools closed and teachers dispersed. The libraries that wealthy Romans had assembled, some quite extensive, were scattered or destroyed as estates were abandoned, as invaders swept through, as the infrastructure that supported civilization fell apart. Christianity offered continuity where secular institutions failed. The Church maintained Latin as its language, maintained written records of its administration, maintained some tradition of learning even as secular education collapsed. The monasteries that spread across Europe in the early medieval period became repositories of whatever remained of classical learning. Not because monks valued pagan philosophy, but because they needed texts for their own education, because some classical works were useful for teaching grammar and rhetoric, because preservation became habit as libraries accumulated. The Irish monasteries were distinctive. Christianity reached Ireland not through Roman conquest, but through missionaries arriving in the 5th century and spreading rapidly through a society that had never been Romanized. The monasteries that emerged combined Irish traditions with continental Christianity, developing distinctive forms of art and scholarship, creating illuminated manuscripts whose intricate knotwork designs remain iconic, and the Irish monks developed a passion for learning that extended beyond religious texts to include classical work, grammatical treatises, histories, whatever texts they could acquire. The island's isolation protected these collections. While Germanic tribes swept through Gaul and Britain, Ireland remained relatively secure. The Viking raids that would devastate Irish monasteries in the 9th century had not yet begun. For several centuries, Irish monasteries could accumulate and preserve texts that were being destroyed elsewhere. The scriptorium was the heart of monastic learning. Here, in a room designed to catch whatever natural light the gray Irish sky provided, monks sat at their desks and copied. The work was tedious, was physically demanding, was performed in cold that numbed fingers and darkness that strained eyes. Monks complained in marginal notes that survive in their manuscripts about the cold, about the difficulty of the text, about the tedium of copying the same words day after day. But they continued because the rule required labor, because the abbot assigned the work, because somewhere in the daily grind of copying, the knowledge they preserved passed through their hands and into their minds. The illuminated manuscripts that survive from this period are extraordinary. The Book of Kells, probably created on Iona in the late 8th century, transforms the four Gospels into art, each page a composition of elaborate initials, intricate borders, miniature paintings, the text itself becoming visual design. The labor required was immense, months or years for a single manuscript, the work of multiple scribes and artists, the careful preparation of vellum and pigments. The result was not merely book, but icon, sacred object that proclaimed the importance of the words it contained. But the monasteries also copied texts that were less visually elaborate, classical Latin works, Virgil, Cicero, portions of other authors, were copied by monks who needed them for teaching Latin grammar, medical texts, astronomical tables, mathematical treatises were copied because useful knowledge was valuable. Not everything survived. The selection was haphazard, dependent on what texts were available, what monks were interested in, what abbots thought worth preserving. but enough survived to maintain threads of connection to classical learning. The Irish monks became missionaries, carrying their learning back to the continent that had taught Christianity to Ireland. Columba founded Iona, which became center of Scottish Christianity. Columbanus founded monasteries in Gaul and Italy, bringing Irish learning and discipline to regions that had lost both. The Anglo-Saxon monasteries that emerged in Britain, Lindisfarne, Wearmouth Jarrow, combined Irish and continental traditions, creating centers of learning that preserved and transmitted classical texts. Bede, the scholar monk of Jarrow, who died in 735, epitomizes what monastic learning could achieve. His ecclesiastical history of the English people combined classical historiographical methods with Christian perspective, creating work that remains essential for understanding early English history. His calculations of the date of Easter required sophisticated astronomical and mathematical knowledge. His commentaries on Scripture drew on patristic sources accumulated over centuries. Bede's library was not large by later standards, perhaps a few hundred volumes, but it was sufficient to support scholarship of genuine importance. The Viking raids that began in 793 with the attack on Lindisfarne threatened what the monasteries had preserved. Monks were killed, monasteries burned, libraries destroyed. The survivors fled to safer locations, carrying what manuscripts they could. Some texts were lost in the attacks, others were preserved by flight, still others were copied in the brief periods of peace between raids. The destruction was severe, but not total, and the tradition of monastic learning survived, adapted, eventually contributed to the Carolingian Renaissance of the 9th century and the later revival of European learning. Tonight, Skellig Michael rises from the Atlantic, abandoned since the 12th century, its beehive huts still standing on terraces carved into rock. Monks lived here for 600 years, enduring isolation and hardship, practicing asceticism that modern comfort cannot imagine. They copied texts by candlelight, prayed through cold nights, maintained learning at the edge of the known world. The manuscripts they produced are scattered across European libraries now, but the stones they built with still stand, still witness to dedication that preserved what carelessness would have destroyed. The monastery at world's edge, copying through darkness, preserving what the world had forgotten it needed, still standing, still witnessing, still testifying to the fragility of knowledge and the devotion of those who refuse to let it die. Beneath the shadow of Vesuvius, where volcanic ash sealed a moment forever, a library was found, not scrolls stored in cases, but carbonized cylinders that looked like charcoal and contained philosophy. The eruption that destroyed Herculaneum and Pompeii in 79 CE also preserved what would otherwise have rotted, including nearly 2,000 scrolls that modern technology is only beginning to read. The villa of the papyri was palatial, belonging to wealthy Roman whose identity remains debated. possibly Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesonius, Julius Caesar's father-in-law. The villa stretched along the coastline, its rooms filled with art, bronze statues, marble sculptures, mosaic floors, frescoed walls, and in one section, a library where scrolls were stored on shelves, where readers could recline on couches and study, where the accumulated wisdom of Greek philosophy waited for those who wished to learn. The eruption came in August of 79. Vesuvius had been quiet for centuries. The Romans did not know it was a volcano, did not recognize the warning signs, earthquakes, rising ground, gas emissions that preceded the catastrophe. When the mountain exploded, it sent a column of pumice and ash 20 miles into the sky. Pompeii, downwind, was buried under falling debris. Herculaneum, closer but upwind, was initially spared. But then the eruption column collapsed, sending pyroclastic flows, superheated gas and rock rushing down the mountain that buried the city in moments. The heat was intense, temperatures sufficient to carbonize organic material, to turn flesh to bone, and scroll to char. But the speed of burial was also preservation. The pyroclastic flows sealed everything beneath them, cut off air, prevented the decay that would otherwise have destroyed organic materials. The scrolls in the Villa of the Papyri, exposed to heat but protected from rot, became carbonized, blackened, brittle, but intact. Their text preserved in the carbon that their papyrus had become. Herculaneum's rediscovery began in the 18th century when workers digging a well struck ancient buildings. The Villa of the Papyri was explored through tunnels dug into the volcanic rock, its treasures extracted through shafts that remain visible today. The scrolls presented immediate challenge. How to read something that looked like burned wood, that crumbled at the touch, that had been sealed for 17 centuries. Early attempts at unrolling were disastrous. Scrolls that survived the eruption were destroyed by archaeologists, their carbonized layers fragmenting as they were pulled apart, their text lost to overconfident handling. A monk named Antonio Piaggio invented a machine that could unroll scrolls slowly, taking months or years for a single scroll. But the process still damaged the texts it revealed. The fragments that survived showed the scrolls contained mostly Epicurean philosophy, works by Philodemus, a Greek philosopher associated with the villa's owner, whose writings had been lost except for what survived at Herculaneum. For 2 centuries, the scrolls remained largely unread, too fragile to unroll, too carbonized to examine. They sat in Naples's National Library, testifying to what had been preserved without revealing what it said. Other treasures from the villa, the bronze statues, the architectural features, became famous, but the scrolls remained mysterious, their contents inaccessible. Then technology changed what was possible. In the 21st century, researchers began using CT scans, X-ray imaging that could see inside objects without opening them, to examine the scrolls. They could detect differences in the carbon of the papyrus and the carbon of the ink, could identify where text existed without physically unrolling. Artificial intelligence learned to recognize letters, to trace words across fragmentary images, to read what human eyes could not distinguish. The Vesuvius Challenge, launched in 2023, offered prizes to researchers who could decipher characters from the scrolls. Progress was remarkable. Within a year, contestants had identified thousands of characters, had read passages that no one had seen since the eruption, had begun to reveal what the villa's library contained. Greek philosophy emerged from the carbonized remains, texts that added to our knowledge of Epicureanism, works that existed nowhere else, voices speaking after 2,000 years of silence. What else lies buried? The villa has not been fully excavated. Further scrolls may remain in unexplored sections, and Herculaneum itself covers only part of the ancient town. Other buildings, other libraries, other collections may lie beneath volcanic rock and modern city. The technology that is reading the carbonized scrolls could potentially read others if they are found, if they can be extracted without destruction. The irony is profound. The eruption that killed thousands, that ended two prosperous cities, that became synonym for catastrophe. That same eruption preserved a library that time would otherwise have destroyed. The heat that carbonized the scrolls also stabilized them. The ash that buried the villa protected it from the centuries of disturbance that destroyed other Roman buildings. Destruction became preservation. Catastrophe became accidental archive. Tonight, Vesuvius rises above the Bay of Naples, quiet but not extinct. The cities it destroyed, they lie partially excavated, open to tourists who walk streets that Romans walked, who see houses that Romans decorated, who imagine lives interrupted in August of 79. The Villa of the Papyri is closed to visitors, its tunnels unsafe, its contents removed to museums and research laboratories. But the mountain remembers what it buried. The ash still holds what the eruption preserved, the buried library of ash, preserved by what destroyed the world around it, still yielding secrets. 2 millennia after the scrolls were sealed in darkness, still speaking after centuries of silence. The ash that fell that day, the knowledge that survived, the voices that are only now beginning to speak again. Within Vatican walls, doors lead to rooms that centuries of scholars were forbidden to enter. The Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, now renamed Apostolic Archive, but still carrying the aura of its former name, holds documents accumulated over more than 12 centuries. Papal correspondence, diplomatic records, trial transcripts, administrative files, the machinery of church governance, preserved in 53 miles of shelving. For most of its history, these archives were closed to outside scholars, protected not from enemies, but from the church's own faithful. The term secretum did not originally mean secret in the modern sense, but rather private. belonging to the Pope personally, not to be confused with the public archives of Vatican offices, but the connotation of hidden knowledge accumulated over centuries, reinforced by limited access and rumors of suppressed documents. What did the Vatican archives contain? What secrets had the Church preserved? What embarrassing or dangerous materials were locked away from scholars who might use them to challenge Church authority? The reality, as is often the case, is less dramatic than the speculation. The Vatican archives contain immense quantities of administrative records, the routine paperwork of a large, long lived institution, letters to and from popes, instructions to bishops, reports from nuncios, records of tribunals and commissions and consistories. The documents are fascinating for historians, but rarely sensational. The Church did suppress some documents, did restrict access to materials that might prove embarrassing, but the overall collection is bureaucratic rather than scandalous. Some specific holdings have achieved fame. The trial record of the Knights Templar, suppressed in 1312, was long believed lost until discovered in the Vatican archives in 2001. The trial of Galileo, whose documents were restricted until the late 19th century, revealed the Church's reasoning in condemning heliocentrism. Wrong reasoning, the Church now acknowledges, but reasoning rather than mere persecution. Letters from Michelangelo, from Raphael, from Renaissance figures who dealt with the papacy. These are treasures for art historians, preserved in the archives that protected them. The restricted archive raises questions beyond its specific contents. What should institutions preserve, and what should they make accessible? The Vatican's restrictions were partly practical. The archives were unstaffed for outside research, organized according to church needs rather than scholarly convenience, too vast for the limited personnel available to manage access. But the restrictions also protected the church from scrutiny, prevented scholars from examining records that might reveal institutional failings, created mystique that both attracted and frustrated researchers. The opening of archives, never complete, always conditional, came gradually. Pope Leo XIII opened portions to scholars in 1881, recognizing that controlled access was better than speculation, that responsible research could benefit the Church. Successive popes have opened further sections, including archives from the pontificate of Pius XII, whose wartime record remains controversial. Each opening reveals not shocking secrets, but human complexity, records of decisions made under pressure, communications that show uncertainty where public pronouncements showed confidence, evidence that the institution was no better and no worse than the humans who composed it. Other religious archives follow similar patterns. The archives of religious orders, of dioceses, of ecumenical councils all contain restricted materials. All balance preservation with protection. All face questions about what should be made accessible and when. The Dead Sea Scrolls, controlled for decades by a small group of scholars who limited access and publication, became case study in how restriction harmed scholarship, how possessiveness delays understanding, how academic politics can obstruct knowledge. But archives can be opened too quickly. The looting of Soviet archives after 1991 scattered documents, disrupted organization, destroyed context that archivists had maintained. The rush to digitize everything can overwhelm institutions, can expose documents that harm individuals without benefit to scholarship, can privilege access over preservation. The balance is genuine, the questions are real, and the Vatican's caution, while often excessive, was not entirely without justification. Tonight, the Vatican walls enclose the archive that holds centuries of church history. The reading room is quiet. The staff has gone home. The shelves stretch into darkness that artificial light cannot fully penetrate. Somewhere in those 53 miles of shelving, documents wait that have not been read since they were filed, letters that were written and answered and forgotten, records of decisions that shaped institutions and lives, and are now of interest only to historians. The forbidden archive, locked against its own faithful, opened gradually, revealing not secrets but bureaucracy, not scandal but complexity, not hidden truth but the accumulated paperwork of 1,000 years, still locked in parts, still holding documents whose significance is unknown, still waiting for the scholars who will find what has been hidden, who will reveal what was protected, who will read what was written for other eyes, in other times for purposes long forgotten. Not all lost libraries were burned or buried. Some were never written. The Shadow Archive holds books, planned but never completed, texts begun but abandoned, knowledge carried in minds that died before hands could write. This is the largest library of all, and its holdings grow with every sunset that finds work unfinished. Consider what we know was lost before it could be preserved. Aristotle's dialogues, praised by Cicero as rivers of gold, vanished completely. We have only the lecture notes, the treatises, the dense technical works that were not meant for general readers. Livy's History of Rome extended to 142 books. 107 are lost, leaving gaps in our knowledge of crucial periods. Sappho, the greatest woman poet of the ancient world, survives in fragments, some single words, some partial stanzas, enough to know her genius, but not enough to know her fully. These were texts that existed, that were copied and circulated, that survived for centuries before being lost. The library of unwritten books contains texts that never reached even that first stage of preservation. Every author who died before completing their work contributed to this library. The projects outlined but never begun. The chapters drafted but never finished. The ideas gestating when death intervened. All became holdings in the archive of absence. We know of some. Chaucer never completed the Canterbury Tales, leaving us to wonder how the Pilgrim's Return journeys might have gone. Gogol burned the second part of Dead Souls in religious mania, then died before he could rewrite it. Kafka asked that his unpublished works be destroyed. Fortunately, his executor disobeyed, but we do not know of most. The farmers and craftspeople and ordinary people of ancient civilizations had stories and knowledge that were never written because they never had access to writing. Women's voices were systematically excluded from written record. We have a handful of female authors from antiquity because only a handful were allowed to write. Slaves, who formed substantial portions of ancient populations, left almost no written records. We know them only through documents created by their owners. The library of unwritten books contains entire literatures that were suppressed by social structures, entire traditions that oral cultures never committed to writing, entire worldviews that those in power saw no reason to preserve. The loss continues. Indigenous languages die daily, taking with them oral literatures that will never be recorded. Academic pressures to publish create floods of partial work while preventing the deep scholarship that requires years of undisturbed concentration. Writers in difficult circumstances, war zones, refugee camps, oppressive regimes, cannot write what circumstances prevent. The library of unwritten books grows faster than any preservation effort can match. Some unwritten books are reconstructed from traces. Biblical scholars hypothesize a source that Matthew and Luke allegedly used for material not found in Mark, a text that may never have existed in written form, may have been oral tradition, may have been lost so early that no direct evidence survives. Classical scholars reconstruct lost works from quotations in surviving texts, from summaries and references, from the silhouette that absence creates. The fragments of Heraclitus, of the pre Socratic philosophers, of lost historians and poets, these are partially recovered, their edges traced through what surrounded them. But most unwritten books leave no trace at all. The idea that occurred to someone who never had paper, the story that a grandmother told and a grandchild forgot, the observation that a farmer made about his crops that might have advanced agriculture if recorded, that was lost when the farmer died. The library of unwritten books contains infinitely more than any library of written books could hold, contains everything that could have been thought and recorded, but was not, contains the full potential of human consciousness that circumstances prevented from expression. This library cannot be mourned specifically because its contents are unknown. We cannot miss what we do not know existed, but we can mourn generally, can recognize that what we have is a tiny fraction of what might have been, that the written record is not comprehensive but highly selective, that survival required circumstances favorable to creation, preservation, and transmission. We can honor what was written by recognizing what was not, can appreciate what survives by acknowledging what was lost. Tonight, the library of unwritten books grows. Somewhere, someone dies before finishing what they meant to write. Somewhere, someone's story is never recorded because no one asks to hear it. Somewhere, knowledge that could transform understanding exists only in a mind that will not share it, cannot share it, will carry it to a grave that buries knowledge along with body. The library of unwritten books, where ideas died before birth, where knowledge lived and vanished in the space between minds, where the largest archive is the one that holds nothing, that contains only absence, that grows with every thought that is never written down. As sleep approaches and the boundaries between waking and dreaming blur, we arrive at the final library, not a building, but a possibility, not a collection, but a hope. The library at the end of night holds all books that were ever written and all books that were never written, all knowledge that was preserved and all knowledge that was lost. It exists in the space between consciousness and unconsciousness, in the moment when the mind loosens its grip on the boundaries of reality. This is the library that Borges imagined, the infinite hexagonal rooms containing every possible book, including every book that could exist, including books that are nothing but nonsense, but also including books that reveal the meaning of existence. It is the Akashic record of mystical tradition, where every event that has ever occurred is preserved, accessible to those whose consciousness can reach it. It is the collective unconscious, where the archetypes of human experience wait to speak to those who dream deeply enough to hear them. Does such a library exist? The question cannot be answered in daylight, where logic demands evidence and evidence requires physical presence, but in the loosened awareness of deepest night. The question becomes different, not whether the library exists, but whether we can reach it, not whether the books are real, but whether we can read them, not whether the lost knowledge persists, but whether we can recover what seems lost forever. The sleeper's journey toward this library begins with letting go of the certainty that what is burned is gone forever, letting go of the finality that makes loss absolute, letting go of the boundaries that separate mind from mind, past from present, what was from what might have been. The library at the end of night asks only that we approach with openness, with willingness to receive what the darkness offers. Consider what such a library would contain: the complete works of Sappho, every poem, every fragment restored, the dialogues of Aristotle, rivers of gold flowing once more, the scrolls of Alexandria, unburned, their knowledge accessible, the secrets of Eleusinian mysteries revealed at last, the oral literatures of cultures that never developed writing, preserved in spoken form that somehow became permanent, the thoughts of everyone who ever lived, their perspectives available for those who wish to understand. Everything that was lost, everything that was never recorded, everything that consciousness has touched, preserved in a medium that does not decay. But the library at the end of night does not provide answers, provides instead the dream of answers, the hope that loss is not final, the comfort that what seems gone might somehow persist. The comfort is real, even if the library is not. The hope matters, even if it cannot be fulfilled. The dream of recovery allows us to grieve what was lost without despair, allows us to honor what was created without mourning only its destruction. Tonight, we approach this library not as scholars demanding evidence, but as dreamers seeking peace. We do not insist that it exists, only that we wish it did. We do not claim to have read its holdings, only that we hope someone, somewhere, might access what we cannot. The library at the end of night is gentle with our uncertainty, accepts our agnosticism, offers its shelves without requiring belief. The journey through ancient libraries comes to its end here, in the library that may not exist, but that we need, in the collection that holds everything we lost and everything we never had, in the hope that knowledge persists beyond the destruction that seems to end it. We have walked the corridors of Alexandria and the scriptoria of Irish monasteries. We have descended into Egyptian tombs and climbed to mountain caves. We have mourned what fire destroyed and honored what isolation preserved. And now we rest in the possibility that none of it was truly lost, that somewhere beyond waking, beyond the reach of logic, the library continues. Sleep well. The night deepens, and the library waits. Its doors are always open. Its shelves extend into darkness that holds everything. The books that were burned are here, restored. The scrolls that drowned are here, dried rod and readable. The manuscripts that were never written are here, inscribed by hands that time did not stop. Everything is here. Everything waits. The library at the end of night, where all books return, where nothing is lost forever, where the sleeper's dream becomes, for a moment, indistinguishable from truth. Rest now. The journey is complete. The shelves still remember names. Closing. The dawn will come, as dawn always does. And with it, the return to waking life, where libraries are buildings, and books are objects, and loss is real. The fire that burned Alexandria will remain unquenchable. The scrolls that dissolved in salt water will remain unrecoverable. The knowledge that died with those who carried it will remain unknown. The day has no patience for the dreams of night, no tolerance for hope that cannot be proven, no interest in libraries that exist only in the space between sleeping and waking. But the night's journey leaves us something behind, leaves the memory of libraries that preserved against impossible odds, that maintained the thread of learning through centuries of darkness, that trusted future generations to value what past generations had created, leaves the recognition that we are custodians of knowledge passed to us through chains of preservation, stretching back millennia, that we bear responsibility to preserve and transmit, that what we protect or neglect will determine what our descendants can know, leaves the understanding that loss is real but so is preservation. That catastrophe happens, but so does care. That for every library that burned, someone somewhere was copying its texts by candlelight, was carrying its scrolls to safety, was maintaining the thread that connects us to all who came before. The ancient libraries are gone. Their buildings are ruins or are buried beneath modern cities or have vanished completely. Their collections are scattered across museums and private holdings and unknown locations. Their catalogs are lost, so we cannot even know what we lost. But the books that survived speak for those that did not. The knowledge that reached us testifies to the value of what was lost. The fragments that remain give us glimpses of wholes we cannot reconstruct. Tonight, we have honored what was preserved and mourned what was lost. We have walked through temples and monasteries, through volcanic ash and Atlantic storms, through the vaults of restricted archives and the holds of sinking ships. We have traced the fragile thread of human knowledge through all that threatened to cut it, have recognized both the miraculous survival and the irreplaceable losses. The night ends. The dawn approaches. The library at the end of night fades as waking returns, leaving behind only the sense that something was there, that shelves extended into darkness, that books waited for readers who might never come. Sleep well. And when you wake, remember, every book you read is a survivor. Every text you hold arrived through chains of copying and preservation that extend back centuries or millennia. Every piece of knowledge you possess was protected by someone who thought it worth protecting, was transmitted by someone who thought it worth transmitting, was preserved by accident and by intention through all that threatened to destroy it. The libraries of the ancient world are gone, but their legacy continues. In every library, in every book, in every mind that holds knowledge it did not create, the ancient libraries live on, their shelves still remembering names, their voices still speaking through the silence of centuries. Rest now. The shelves will be there when you return. The end.